They told you Tudor marriages were orderly, but they never told you what crawled beneath the surface. Behind every polished vow lay two women who knew too much. One man who controlled too little, and a set of rules no one dared to speak aloud. Every gesture hid a threat, every silence concealed a wound, and every smile masked a quiet war waiting to ignite. Tonight, you will walk into the house where no one is truly free. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is, where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to look closely at the marriages arranged within Tudor households, the first thing that would strike them is how little affection had to do with the matter. These unions were crafted with the stillness of contracts, sealed not with tenderness, but with signatures, dowries, and the weight of lineage pressing down on every decision. A bride entered a household not as a partner but as an investment, an extension of two families measuring their alliances, debts, ambitions, and survival against one another. Nothing in this arrangement asked whether two people could live together without resentment. Nothing required their hearts to bend toward each other. What mattered was the map of bloodlines, the flow of land, and the rooms of influence quietly shifting hands. The woman chosen to become a wife was selected long before anyone bothered to know her mind. Her value was written in the threads of her ancestry, in the estates behind her name, and in the political currents her marriage could stir. To outsiders, she appeared adorned in silk and pearls, lifted by ceremony. Yet beneath the fabric was a truth that did not soften. She was there because her family could offer something her future husband desired. Her presence at the altar was evidence of negotiation, not affection. Even her vows were less a promise between two people and more a silent treaty between two houses. Inside these carefully curated unions, the woman learned early that her emotions were irrelevant. Love was considered unpredictable, a luxury for the naive, something far too fragile to anchor a household expected to endure storms of politics, inheritance, and reputation. A Tudor wife was expected to enter marriage as one steps into a role, rehearsed and composed, ready to display loyalty to a man she did not choose and might never come to understand. Her life was handed over like a ledger, exchanged for the security her family sought, and she learned not to question the fairness of the arrangement. Every aspect of her married life reflected the truth that affection was optional, but obedience was not. The household looked to her for decorum, fertility, and silent resilience. Whether she felt alone, frightened, or unseen mattered very little. She was there to hold the family's name upright, to walk beside her husband during ceremonies, to bear heirs if she could, and to avoid becoming the source of any embarrassment. That was the extent of the expectations placed upon her. Yet it was a burden that shaped every breath she took behind closed doors. There were moments when she might catch herself wondering what marriage could have been if she had been allowed to choose, if she had known her husband before the ceremony, if they had spoken without witnesses, if their lives had touched without obligation. But such thoughts were considered unproductive. Feelings were treated as distractions, even dangers. A woman who desired her husband too much risked being labelled foolish. A woman who disliked him too openly risked far worse. There was no safe register for emotion. Everything had to be folded away, hidden beneath the calm exterior expected of a Tudor wife. Even her wedding day, the grand celebration that marked the beginning of her official duties, was filled with people who understood exactly why she was there. She appeared radiant, not because she was cherished, but because she was useful. Every guest could read the unspoken lines. This marriage was arranged to strengthen positions, to secure land, to prevent disputes. to elevate both families in a society where standing meant everything. Her husband's smile was not always a sign of affection. Often, it was merely the satisfaction of obtaining something valuable. To imagine that love might grow later was a hope many wives kept quietly inside them, though few would admit it. Some couples found companionship over time, but others lived as strangers under the same roof, bound by duty rather than closeness. What mattered was not whether they liked each other, but whether the alliance held firm under scrutiny. The marriage did not need to be warm. It only needed to function. Through all of this, the Tudor wife carried herself with a deliberate stillness. She learned to listen more than she spoke, to observe more than she reacted, to endure without letting her endurance be seen as suffering. The silence she maintained was not weakness, but the expected behavior of a woman raised to understand her place in a hierarchy that valued her lineage above her heart. The world around her treated affection as a complication. She was taught to treat it as a threat. History often paints these marriages as glamorous, wrapped in velvet and ceremony. But the truth was far colder. Behind the locked doors of Tudor households were women who had been exchanged like finely crafted objects, admired for their worth, yet rarely asked what they wanted. Their husbands were bound by duty too, but their duties granted them freedoms the wives did not possess. Freedoms that would later make room for mistresses, secrets, and a second system of unwritten rules operating in the shadows. And so, before the mistress ever entered the story, before whispers of rivalry or hidden tension, the wife was already living within a structure that denied her the most basic human wish, to be chosen for who she was rather than what she represented. This foundation of restraint and expectation shaped everything that came next, turning her marriage into a place where affection was not the point, and where silence was the only safe language left to her. In the quiet of her chambers, she understood that this union was never meant to offer comfort. It existed to preserve names, not feelings, and its purpose cast a long shadow across every room she entered. And somewhere beyond that shadow, another presence would one day disturb the fragile balance she had been taught to protect. Her position within the Tudor household appeared unshakable from the outside, fixed by ceremony, law, and the weight of her family's name. Yet the stability others imagined for her was far more fragile than anyone cared to admit. She stood in rooms where her presence was required, but her voice was optional. A figure meant to embody the dignity of her lineage rather than her own desires. People bowed when she entered, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented, a bridge between two families, a confirmation that alliances had been honored, and a reminder that order had been maintained. At least on the surface, her existence was proof of continuity, a living emblem rather than a participant in her own fate. Every gesture expected of her was shaped by the laws that defined marriage rather than the bond between two people. Her authority in the household derived not from her husband's affection, but from the legal recognition of her role. That distinction mattered. Affection could fade or shift. The law did not. She knew her place was secure only so long as she behaved in accordance with the expectations tied to her station. She could host guests, manage certain domestic matters, stand beside her husband during public events, and be acknowledged as the legitimate partner in the lineage of heirs. But beyond these boundaries, the reach of her influence stopped abruptly, as though an invisible line had been drawn to remind her that she belonged to the structure, not the other way around. In daily life, she often moved like a shadow beside her own existence. She could walk through the manor halls and feel the weight of portraits staring back at her. Women who had accepted the same rigid mold, whose names were remembered not for deeds, but for births, alliances, and endurance. Her position was lawful, recognized, and displayed, yet she was careful not to mistake legality for authority. Her name appeared in documents, but decisions rarely hinged on her thoughts. She was consulted when it was convenient, ignored when it was not. Her importance was constant, yet her power was conditional. During gatherings, her presence signaled propriety. She sat in the seat assigned to her, smiled with the restraint expected of a woman mindful of appearances, and allowed others to read her composure as strength, even when it was merely necessity. People described her with words like graceful, respectable, and dutiful. Yet none of those words explained the quiet negotiations she made with herself each day. She understood that dignity was not given to her freely. She had to perform it, preserve it, and protect it from whispers that could erode everything she had been positioned to uphold. She served as the household's public facade, the figure guests watched during dinners, ceremonies, and celebrations. Her posture, her clothing, or her silence, all of them were statements that reinforced the legitimacy of her marriage and, by extension, her husband's standing. Even when she felt small inside her own life, she had to appear unshaken. A single misstep could invite questions, and questions could invite judgment. In a world where reputation was both weapon and shield, she learned that stability was an illusion sustained by vigilance. Her legal role granted her certain protections, but it also bound her tightly to expectations she could not escape. If she was unhappy, she concealed it. If her husband grew distant, she endured it. If others whispered about changes in the household, she pretended not to hear. The law recognized her, but it did not defend her feelings. It confirmed her place, but did not guarantee respect within it. She lived with the knowledge that her husband's choices could shift the balance of their marriage, creating new dynamics she would be expected to withstand without allowing the strain to show. Those who saw her walking through the manor might assume she possessed the authority her title implied. Yet she knew that the true measure of her influence lay in how well she navigated invisibility. Her presence mattered deeply, yet her opinions often mattered little. Her security rested on her ability to perform the role of the lawful wife without drawing attention to the parts of the role that wounded her. She was the emblem of honor, even if she was not always treated with it. Still, she held tightly to the aspects of her identity that remained untouched by the shifting currents around her. She observed everything, catalogued small changes in behavior, noticed the absences that others ignored, and recognized early signs of tension within the household. Her awareness became her quiet defense, even if it did not grant her control. In a world where she was required to be both visible and voiceless, understanding the unspoken dynamics around her was the closest she could come to wielding influence. Her position was secure only in appearance, resting on fragile expectations that demanded constant vigilance. She knew that her place in the household depended less on affection than on the roles others needed her to perform. And beyond her carefully maintained composure, a subtle disturbance was beginning to take shape beneath the surface she was sworn to preserve. There was a point in nearly every Tudor marriage when the quiet balance inside the household shifted, not through confrontation but through an unspoken understanding shared by everyone except, perhaps, the wife herself. It was common knowledge that a man of status would seek companionship beyond the marriage arranged for him. And society treated this diversion not as a scandal, but as something expected, almost routine. The presence of another woman, kept discreetly, managed carefully, fit so neatly into the structure of the time that few questioned its place. It slipped into the household like a draft through an open window, faint at first, then unmistakable. The world around the wife had long prepared itself for this possibility. Servants noticed before she did, speaking in careful fragments that never reached her directly. Friends avoided certain topics, offering hollow reassurances wrapped in polite silence. Even her husband, who still greeted her with the same expressions of obligation and courtesy, carried an ease in his demeanor that betrayed the comfort he had found elsewhere. She sensed the change without needing confirmation. The shift in his gaze, The shortened conversations, the way he withdrew earlier from shared spaces. Each detail etched a quiet truth she could not voice. Men of the period faced no great judgment for seeking affection or desire outside their marriage. Their authority granted them freedoms that society rarely questioned. A husband's infidelity was not treated as betrayal, but as a natural expression of his position, a privilege woven into the privileges he already held. Those around him viewed it with indifference, so long as it did not disrupt the household's public image. What mattered most was composure, and as long as the arrangement remained discreet, decorum stayed intact. The woman who entered his life under these conditions was not always seen as a threat. In many households, people spoke of such women with a mixture of resignation and practicality, as though their presence filled a space the marriage was never intended to satisfy. She was tolerated, even pitied at times, so long as she observed the invisible lines that had been drawn for her. The mistress knew her role because society had made it clear she could be desired, but she could not appear claiming anything beyond that. Her influence existed only in shadows, and she survived by understanding the boundaries she must not cross. The wife, however, lived with the consequences of this quiet intrusion, though no one would speak openly of it. She bore the weight of maintaining dignity for the household. She could not voice anger without risking disgrace. She could not demand answers without appearing irrational. She could only absorb the truth that her marriage had been built on political necessity rather than intimacy, and that the world expected her to remain composed even as her husband's attention drifted elsewhere. The law acknowledged her, affection did not. In this delicate arrangement, everyone understood the unwritten rules. The husband indulged in his desires without fearing social repercussions. The mistress accepted her place on the margins, rewarded by secrecy and whatever affection he offered. The household adjusted itself, quietly shifting its routines to accommodate the new dynamic. And the wife, whose role was supposed to be the most secure, was required to act as though nothing had changed, even when everything had. It was not unusual for the mistress to be known but not acknowledged, seen but not spoken of, tolerated but never formally recognized. She existed in a liminal space, significant enough to draw the husband's attention, insignificant enough to demand no legitimacy. Her survival depended on remaining appropriate, on never reaching for what the wife represented. The moment she forgot her place, the illusion of acceptance fractured. To walk through the manor during this time was to feel the subtle rearrangement of the air. Doors closed more quietly. Conversations ended abruptly when certain footsteps approached. The wife sensed eyes, avoiding hers, not out of disrespect, but out of discomfort. Because everyone else had already learned to live with a truth she was expected to pretend not to know. She bore the tension silently, her composure becoming the last barrier between order and humiliation. Underneath all of this was the simple, unforgiving reality. Society accepted the mistress because society accepted the imbalance that created her. Male authority justified the arrangement, and no one questioned a system designed to serve the desires of one at the expense of another. The wife was lawful, but the mistress was convenient, and convenience often carried more weight in practice than legality did. The presence of another woman settled into the household long before anyone dared acknowledge it aloud. Its acceptance revealed more about the world they lived in than about the individuals caught within its structure. From the quiet edges of that uneasy balance, something began to stir in ways no one wished to name. Silence entered the household long before confrontation ever had the chance to form. It settled between the wife and the mistress like a thin film of frost, delicate enough to break with a single breath, yet somehow strong enough to hold an entire structure of expectations together. Both women understood what the other represented, and both knew that acknowledging it aloud would fracture the fragile order that their world depended on. The unspoken truth passed between them in glances, in tensions that never softened, in pauses that lasted a heartbeat too long. It lived in the spaces where words might have been, shaping the rhythm of their days without either daring to claim its existence. The wife recognized the arrival of this silence in subtle ways. It appeared in the lowered eyes of servants, who once greeted her without hesitation. It appeared in the hushed tone her husband used when mentioning evenings spent away. It appeared in the shift of her own breathing whenever she entered a room where she sensed unfamiliar footsteps had recently passed. Nothing was openly confessed to her. Nothing needed to be. Silence carried its own declarations, and she felt each one. She carried herself with a posture refined by years of learning that emotion must never be shown without purpose. But beneath that surface, her mind traced the patterns that had begun forming around her. She understood that the mistress's presence was not temporary. It had woven itself into the routines of the household. Not boldly, but with the careful subtlety of someone who knew the cost of being noticed too soon. The wife began to sense the other woman's influence in the smallest adjustments. The placement of objects on a table, the timing of meals, the faint shift in her husband's manner. The changes were slight, but their accumulation told a story none of them would speak aloud. The mistress felt the weight of this silence as well. She walked through the edges of the household with measured steps, aware that each movement carried consequences she could not afford to provoke. Her survival depended on invisibility, yet invisibility demanded constant performance. She understood that the wife saw her even when pretending not to. She also understood that the entire situation rested on the wife's restraint, a restraint she could neither trust nor challenge. Every day, she balanced herself in that narrow space between presence and absence, hoping the line would not shift beneath her. The women rarely encountered one another directly, but when they did, the air around them tightened. Their gazes met only briefly, but within that fleeting exchange lived the truth they were forbidden to voice. The wife's expression remained composed, shaped by years of discipline. The mistress's gaze held deference, caution, and an unspoken plea for the fragile arrangement not to crack. Neither woman reacted outwardly. Their silence maintained the illusion of order, but beneath it lay a strain too persistent to ignore. The most unsettling aspect of their tension was that society required both to maintain this facade. The wife was expected to protect her dignity by refusing to acknowledge the mistress. The mistress was expected to preserve her safety by pretending she posed no threat. The husband lived untouched by the emotional burden pressing down on the women. He walked easily within the structure that demanded their suffering and excused his comfort. In this world, silence was not simply a choice. It was a carefully enforced rule disguised as decorum. Even the household's smallest moments carried traces of the unspoken knowledge between them. The wife would lift a cup and notice a faint scent unfamiliar to her. The mistress would pass through a corridor and feel the echo of footsteps that were not meant to follow her. Shared objects, shared spaces, shared routines. They became battlegrounds disguised as ordinary life. Neither woman dared to break the quiet, because breaking it meant admitting what everyone already knew but could not publicly recognize. This silent coexistence became its own kind of tension, stretching thin across their days like a thread waiting to snap. Both women lived inside the pressure of knowing that one wrong word could destroy the delicate architecture of appearances. They protected the household's dignity not because they wished to, but because the consequences of truth were too dangerous for either to bear alone. Their silence formed a pact neither agreed to but both upheld. The balance they maintained through silence held the weight of an entire household's expectations. It revealed how deeply their world depended on truths too perilous to acknowledge aloud. In the stillness that lingered around them, a faint shift began to suggest that this fragile calm would not endure untouched. Jealousy, though natural and often unavoidable, was considered one of the most dangerous emotions a Tudor wife could display. The moment it surfaced on her face or slipped into her tone, it threatened to reveal that the structure she upheld, composure, dignity, and restraint, was weaker than it appeared. Society expected her to absorb the discomfort of her husband's divided affections with a stillness that bordered on inhuman. Any sign of envy was interpreted not as a wound inflicted upon her, but as a flaw within her character, a softness unbecoming of a woman meant to hold an entire household's honor in her hands. Her reputation did not rely on intimacy or affection. It relied on her ability to appear untouched by betrayal. She learned this lesson early, not through instruction, but through the silence of older women who had walked the path before her. They never spoke of their own bruised pride or the ache that might have lived behind their eyes. Instead, they showed her how to sit upright when whispers drifted through corridors, how to steady her voice when her husband returned later than expected, how to wear a calm expression even as uncertainty spread through her thoughts. Their guidance came in gestures, in pauses heavy with experience, in glances that carried warnings too delicate to articulate aloud. Jealousy, they taught her, was a private burden. To reveal it would invite judgment she could not afford. Her emotions were meant to remain hidden behind layers of practiced composure. She was expected to maintain an appearance of tranquility, even when she felt the ground shifting beneath her. The household watched her more closely than it watched her husband. Every servant, every visiting guest, every distant relative looked for signs of instability in her demeanor. A misplaced expression could spark rumors. A guarded tone could be interpreted as weakness. Her silence, once again, became her shield, protecting her not from pain, but from humiliation. Inside her private chambers, she allowed herself the briefest moments of honesty. There, away from the eyes that measured her worth through her performance. She felt the strain her role demanded. The knowledge that her husband had found comfort elsewhere pressed against her chest with an unrelenting weight. Still, she reminded herself that acknowledging the hurt served no purpose. She had been raised in a world where a wife's suffering was considered irrelevant, where her distress changed nothing, where her endurance was praised, and her vulnerability scorned. She understood that the mistress's presence, while painful, was not an excuse for emotional collapse. The wife was expected to remain unmoved, to behave as though nothing in her household had shifted. Her calmness reassured the world that the structure remained intact, that the marriage continued to function as intended. In this sense, her composure became a form of public performance, one that grew more demanding the longer she upheld it. The more her husband strayed, the more she was expected to embody serenity. The contradiction was cruel, yet deeply ingrained in the values of the society around her. There were times when she imagined speaking openly, if only to reclaim a fragment of her dignity. But the consequences were clear. To accuse her husband of infidelity would be to accuse herself of failing to maintain his interest. To condemn the mistress would make her appear threatened, petu, or incapable of grace. To reveal jealousy would expose her to scrutiny from those waiting for any sign that her composure was slipping. The silence she inhabited became both prison and armor, suffocating yet necessary. The world granted her no space to express pain without inviting further harm. She held her posture at dinners, participated in ceremonies, welcomed guests with the expected smile, and kept her hands steady even when rumors brushed against her like cold wind. Those around her judged her worth not by her happiness, but by her ability to appear untroubled. She carried the burden of dignity as if it were a fragile vessel, one she had to keep from cracking in full view of those who depended on its unbroken form. The mistress might have felt her own hardships, but they were not the same. The wife's suffering was anchored by legal responsibility, by the weight of heritage, by the role she had been given long before she knew what it truly required. Her dignity was the foundation of the household, the symbol of its stability. And so, she learned to breathe quietly, to swallow her hurt, to let her silence mask the turbulence she could never allow to spill outward. Her restraint became the measure of her strength, recognized only when it hid more than it revealed. It showed how deeply the world demanded composure from a woman who had every reason to tremble. Within that quiet endurance Small cracks began to form, hinting at tensions that would no longer remain invisible. The mistress lived in a world carved into narrow corridors of permission, where every movement depended on the boundaries she was expected to respect. Her presence might have been tolerated, even whispered about with a mix of curiosity and resignation, but it was never to be confused with legitimacy. She existed in the dimmer corners of the household's social sphere, careful never to cast a shadow that stretched too near the wife. The rules surrounding her were not written, yet they governed her life with a firmness sharper than any law. She knew that her position, precarious as it was, could disappear the moment she stepped beyond what others deemed acceptable. One of the most rigid expectations was her absence from public occasions. No matter how devoted the husband seemed behind closed doors, he could not appear beside her in the open spaces of the manor or the streets beyond it. Public life belonged to the wife, whose presence signaled stability, propriety, and continuity. To accompany the husband in view of guests or townsfolk would be an intrusion, a breach that mocked the carefully arranged hierarchy, maintaining the household's reputation. The mistress understood that the world would not forgive her for attempting to occupy a space that was not hers. She was allowed influence only so long as it was invisible. Clothing, too, became a silent battleground. The mistress could dress attractively, but not beautifully enough to provoke comparison. She could adorn herself, but only within limits that reminded everyone she was not the lawful partner. Any attempt to mirror the wife's garments, to echo her colours, her embroidery, her elegance, would be interpreted as an act of provocation. Even the smallest attempt to replicate the dignity embedded in the wife's attire risked disruption. The household watched her clothing more than it watched her expressions, reading ambition where she dared not place it. The mistress navigated these expectations with meticulous caution, choosing fabrics and designs that would not stir resentment or suspicion. More than anything, she was forbidden from displaying any sense of possession over the man whose attention had drawn her into this delicate configuration. Her closeness to him had to remain discreet, her gestures restrained, her words measured. Affection expressed too boldly could be construed as a challenge to the wife, as though she were reaching for a position not meant for her. Even in private, she learned to temper her reactions, aware that servants' eyes lingered longer than they pretended to. The mistress's survival depended on her ability to remain a whisper rather than a declaration. Every day, she practiced the art of minimizing herself. She kept a respectful distance in hallways, stepping aside without hesitation whenever the wife approached. She moderated her voice, careful not to sound overly familiar. Even simple interactions with the husband were executed with an awareness that others observed these exchanges closely, ready to interpret any misstep as a sign of intrusion. Her life became a performance of humility, not because she lacked desire or emotion, but because the slightest miscalculation could cost her everything she had gained. Yet, within this restrained existence, a quiet complexity unfolded. The mistress often found herself balancing longing with caution, affection with fear. She knew she was wanted, yet she also knew she was not permitted to act as though she belonged. She lived in borrowed spaces, borrowed hours, borrowed tenderness. Each moment she spent with her husband carried a shadow, the awareness that it could not be claimed publicly, that it could vanish without explanation, that she would bear the blame if it drew too much attention. The wife, observing from a distance, understood these unspoken rules as well. She recognized that the mistress's compliance upheld a fragile order that allowed her to maintain her position without open confrontation. The wife did not have to speak to assert her authority. It was encoded into the very structure of the household. Her legitimacy required no defense. She did not need to remind the mistress of the limits set upon her. Those limits had been established long before either woman entered the marriage. The household adjusted itself around these boundaries. Servants carried messages with a discretion sharpened by necessity. Schedules shifted quietly to to prevent encounters that might disrupt the carefully managed illusion of harmony. Even the husband, though granted freedoms denied to both women, understood that overt favoritism toward the mistress would destabilize the household. His desires could be indulged, but never displayed. The mistress's place depended on her ability to remain beneath the surface of the household's public life. She walked through its rooms like someone moving through another person's dream, visible only at the edges, heard only in softened footsteps, tolerated only so long as she upheld the delicate balance that kept the household from fracturing. Her existence remained acceptable only while she occupied the shadows assigned to her. This restraint revealed how carefully the household relied on roles that could never be openly questioned. Within the unspoken limits, she observed, a subtle tension gathered, hinting that restraint would not shield her from the forces quietly shifting around her. The division within a Tudor household did not rely on walls or locked doors, yet it shaped every movement that passed through its rooms. Space itself became a language, one that spoke clearly about status, legitimacy, and the quiet hierarchy that governed daily life. The wife inhabited the center of this world. Her presence filled the larger rooms, the halls where guests gathered, the dining chamber where the household received visitors, the chapel where family prayers echoed through stone. These were places meant to be seen, meant to reflect order, meant to carry the weight of tradition. When she entered these spaces, her steps carried the assurance of someone whose role had been sanctioned by law and ceremony. No one questioned her right to stand where she did. Her seat at the table, her place in processions, the rooms she occupied during festivities, all of them reinforced that she was the heart of the household's public life, even when her emotions faltered. The architecture around her held her together, wrapping her in the dignity expected of her station. Servants moved with greater caution in her presence, lowering their voices, adjusting their posture. The household oriented itself around her movements, not because she commanded it directly, but because her legitimacy shaped the rhythm of the space itself. The mistress, by contrast, inhabited a realm that folded behind corners and down quiet corridors. Her world existed in parlours seldom used, chambers tucked away from the main rooms, and the smaller staircases servants relied upon. She entered the household not as an open presence, but as a whisper that moved along its edges. The spaces she occupied were chosen carefully, areas where her appearance would not provoke questions, where she could slip in and out without disturbing the order the wife represented. These back rooms carried a stillness different from the public chambers. Their air felt heavier, as though laden with truths that could not be acknowledged. Light entered more dimly, and the footsteps heard there were softer, cautious, aware of the risk that visibility posed. Even when the mistress felt a fleeting sense of belonging, it was always in a room that did not belong to her. She learned the corners where she would not be seen, the routes that kept her presence discreet, the thresholds she dared not cross. The walls themselves seemed to remind her of the boundaries that held her in place. This separation of space was not random. It reflected an unchanging hierarchy. The wife existed in areas meant to be witnessed, where reputation thrived on visibility. The mistress survived in the shadows, where influence lived only if unnoticed. Even the objects around them reinforced this divide. The wife's rooms held embroidered cushions, polished wood, and the soft glow of candles arranged with care. The mistress's surroundings were simpler, functional, devoid of markers that signaled permanence. Nothing in her environment suggested her presence would be honored years later. Everything hinted at a role meant to be temporary, even if it lasted a lifetime. The household staff understood these divisions instinctively. They knocked before entering the wife's chambers, aware of her authority, even if she rarely needed to wield it. When approaching the mistress, they behaved with a mixture of politeness and restraint, careful not to imply familiarity or disrespect. They delivered messages along routes designed to avoid detection, Their knowledge of space became a silent choreography that kept the household's equilibrium intact. The husband navigated both realms with ease, passing from the wife's world of ceremony to the mistress's world of secrecy, without confronting the tension that separated them. His ability to move freely revealed the imbalance at the center of their lives. The walls that confined the women did not confine him. His presence was welcome everywhere, while theirs was dictated by the roles they had been assigned rather than the desires they might have held. The wife noticed the changes in the household's flow before anyone admitted them. She sensed the faint traces of footsteps where only hers had once been recognized. She observed the shifts in servants' routines, the subtle rearrangement of furniture, and the disappearance of certain items into rooms she did not enter. Her awareness sharpened, not out of jealousy, but out of understanding. Space itself was speaking to her, telling her that another woman had begun leaving her imprint in places she should never touch. For the mistress, these boundaries formed both refuge and reminder. They protected her from direct conflict, while constantly reminding her of what she could not claim. She existed in a place that asked her to remain small, to avoid drawing lines that would expose her presence, to accept that even the walls around her belonged to another woman. These divided spaces revealed a truth the household never dared to name directly. They showed how power unfolded, not in words, but in the rooms each woman was allowed to inhabit. In the quiet tension held between those boundaries, something began to signal that these separations would not remain untouched forever. Living inside a Tudor household meant accepting that two women could revolve around the same man while obeying entirely different sets of expectations. A wife carried duties etched into tradition, each one designed to reinforce the status and stability of her family's name. Her service was formal, public, and unending, even in moments when affection between husband and wife had thinned to a mere trace. She remained responsible for preserving the dignity of their union. She represented continuity, lineage, and the social order that held the household together. Everything she did, every controlled expression, every carefully measured gesture, upheld a reputation others depended on. Existing in that role required discipline that began long before marriage. She had learned as a girl how to lower her gaze without seeming timid, how to speak without revealing too much of herself, how to hide disappointment behind silence. These skills became the very foundation of her married life. In public rooms where polished wood reflected candlelight, she moved as though bearing an invisible crown. Nothing about her role allowed for uncertainty. The world watched her as a symbol, not as a woman, and symbols were expected to remain intact, even when the life beneath them cracked. Operating far from these ceremonial spaces was the mistress, whose position rested on desire rather than legality. Her service to the man did not involve lineage or diplomatic alliances, but the emotional and physical intimacy he sought outside the structured confines of marriage. She was not bound to him through vows, yet she existed under rules just as restrictive. Her influence was real but undocumented, powerful in private but fragile in every other sense. One shift of the husband's favor could remove her from the household entirely, leaving no trace behind except whispers. Navigating such uncertainty demanded precision. She could not appear beside the man in public. Her presence would undermine the legitimacy the wife was meant to represent. Nor could she speak with the ease of someone who believed herself essential. Her role required subtlety, a careful awareness of how loudly she laughed, how long she lingered in a room, how close she stood near the man who brought her into this world of shadows. Even tenderness had to be measured. Excess could be interpreted as ambition, and ambition from a mistress was perilous. While the wife performed dignity, the mistress performed invisibility. She accepted that her hours with the man belonged to a separate realm, one detached from the public events where the marriage was displayed like an emblem. She understood the hierarchy even when unspoken. Her love, should she dare feel it, held no authority. Her longing, should she succumb to it, offered no protection. Her entire existence rested on a delicate balance she did not control. Servants read these differences with practiced eyes. They greeted the wife with formal respect, their movements crisp and deliberate. With the mistress, they softened, uncertain how openly they should acknowledge her. Some offered quiet sympathy, others kept their distance. But all recognized the intricate tension her presence created. The household adapted around the roles both women inhabited, its rhythms shifting to prevent their worlds from colliding too directly. Yet even without confrontation, the connection between the two women carried a weight felt throughout the household. The wife represented honor, the mistress embodied desire. One occupied the official narrative, the other lived in the margins of it. Both roles were burdens, though shaped in different ways. The wife sacrificed emotional freedom for a position. The mistress sacrificed stability for affection. Each paid a price for a man who moved effortlessly between them, unbound by the constraints they endured. In private moments, the wife sometimes sensed that her life had become a performance she did not fully choose. She upheld customs older than anyone living beneath the manor roof. She stood firm in spaces where her husband's infidelity was ignored, not because it was hidden, but because it was expected. Her service to the household felt heavy, yet she maintained it because she understood that stopping would collapse more than her pride. It would collapse the structure entrusted to her. The mistress carried her own quiet sorrow. She knew she could be cherished deeply, yet never acknowledged openly. She lived in moments rather than promises, in glimpses rather than guarantees. Her worth was measured by the temporary comfort she provided, not by permanence. Even when she felt the man's affection, she understood it would never place her at the center of his world. She served his desires, not his future. Both women, though their paths diverged sharply, shared one binding truth. Neither was free to define her place. Their lives bent around the man's authority, their sacrifices hidden beneath expectations that served him and constrained them. Their intersecting roles exposed a fragile arrangement built on unequal demands neither woman had chosen. It revealed how connection could be reshaped into a burden when dictated by forces beyond their control. Amid the heavy stillness surrounding their shared existence, a faint suggestion emerged that such an imbalance would not remain undisturbed forever. Silence was the first language everyone in a Tudor household learned. Long before they understood loyalty or duty, servants, courtiers, attendants, each carried an instinctive awareness that certain truths must never be spoken aloud. They observed the rhythms of the household with sharpened senses, noticing changes in tone, in schedules, in proximity between people who should not be connected so closely. Yet they held their tongues, not out of respect, but out of necessity. Silence protected them. Speech could end their lives as swiftly as any sharpened blade. Servants moved through corridors like shadows, hearing far more than anyone realized. They witnessed the husband's shifting affections, the wife's attempts at composure, the mistress's careful navigation of forbidden spaces. They saw doors closed more softly, garments removed too quickly, glances exchanged with intention. But the rules of their world were unyielding. They were to carry trays, messages, linens, not truths. A spoken observation, even an innocent one, could be interpreted as insolence or betrayal. Survival depended on forgetting what they had seen the moment they turned away. Whispers, when they emerged, travelled only in the smallest doses. In kitchens where steam blurred the air, or in storage rooms where footsteps rarely reached. Servants allowed a word or two to slip into conversation. Even then, the sound of a door hinge was enough to halt every voice. Rumours lived cautiously, like sparks that dared not rise into flame. They curled around invisible boundaries, never daring to step beyond speculation. Everyone knew their limits. Too much curiosity invited punishment. Too much accuracy invited danger. The wife, accustomed to reading the room without receiving confirmation, felt the weight of these unspoken murmurs. She sensed that the household knew more than she was told. When servants lowered their eyes, she understood it was not disrespect but fear. Fear of slipping into honesty. Those closest to her walked a delicate line, offering comfort through gestures rather than words, as if they feared that speaking aloud would shatter the fragile veneer holding the household together. She recognized their caution and realized that her own silence held equal power. Her restraint permitted them to remain mute. The mistress experienced those whispers differently. She caught fragments that brushed against her like cold drafts, suggestions of impropriety, reminders of her place, hints that her presence was tolerated but precarious. Servants did not confront her, but their silence around her felt charged, as though each of them held a truth they were unwilling to voice. She understood that a single careless remark could destroy what little stability she possessed. Her survival depended on invisibility, and invisibility depended on silence. Public truth posed the greatest danger of all. Everyone recognized that if the mistress's role was ever spoken openly, the delicate balance that maintained the household's image would collapse. The wife would face humiliation, the husband scandal, and the mistress ruin. Society embraced a paradox. It accepted infidelity, but rejected its acknowledgement. Hidden sins were tolerable, revealed ones threatened the entire social order. Thus, silence became the architecture holding the household upright. Courtiers who visited the manor understood this as well. They watched interactions with heightened perception, noticing the absence of affection in the marriage and the faint signs of another woman's influence. Yet they made no inquiries. They smiled with polished neutrality, discussed politics, exchanged pleasantries, and pretended not to see what was evident to everyone. To remark upon such matters would be to violate decorum, an offence far greater than the infidelity itself. Even the husband benefited from this unspoken agreement. His actions existed in a realm protected from consequence by silence. He could drift between two worlds without confronting the hurt he caused, because the household had been conditioned to shield him from the truth of his own behavior. Silence insulated him. It preserved his reputation while trapping the women in lives defined by what could never be confessed. Through this unbroken quiet, the household maintained the illusion of harmony. It allowed ceremonies to proceed undisturbed, meals to continue without tension, and the wife to stand gracefully in the place assigned to her. Yet beneath the polished surfaces lay the truth everyone understood but no one dared express. Silence was not peace. It was containment. It was the fragile barrier preventing turmoil from spilling into the open. This enforced quiet revealed how truth could be stifled in the service of appearances. It showed how deeply fear shaped the unspoken agreements that governed their lives. Along the edges of that heavy stillness, a subtle tremor hinted that silence itself might eventually become too fragile to hold what it concealed. Presence was the one authority the wife possessed that could not be questioned, diluted, or rewritten. It carried the weight of law, ceremony, and lineage, forces more enduring than affection or desire. Whenever she stepped into a room, she brought with her the legitimacy that anchored the household's public identity. This legitimacy did not require words. It lived in the way courtiers rose when she entered, in the way servants stiffened their posture, in the way her husband, despite his concealed transgressions, walked beside her with the practiced composure expected of a man accompanied by his lawful partner. Her appearance at formal gatherings was never a simple act of attendance. It was a declaration that the household remained intact. During official events, her position was unmistakable. At feasts, she sat at the table's upper end, where polished candlesticks cast steady light across her features. At ceremonies, she stood a half pace behind her husband, close enough to signal unity, far enough to acknowledge rank. These roles had been performed by countless wives across generations. Yet each iteration carried the same quiet force. Her presence affirmed continuity. It reminded guests, allies, and adversaries alike that the family's line was upheld not by sentiment, but by structure. Even when her marriage was strained under the weight of unspoken truths, her composure did not falter in public spaces. She had learned long ago that dignity was not expressed through emotion, but through restraint. The way she placed her hands, the steadiness of her voice when offering a greeting, the calm tilt of her head as she listened. Each gesture reinforced her place at the center of the household's official life. People watched her closely, searching for fractures they hoped not to find. The absence of visible weakness allowed the illusion of stability to survive. Her authority did not come from commanding others, but from embodying what they expected her to be. In the Tudor world, legitimacy itself held immense power. She represented vows spoken in churches, alliances sealed by families, and promises etched into legal papers. The mistress might share the man's affection, but she could never rival the wife's symbolic force. No matter how deeply the husband strayed into secrecy, he could not rewrite the position the wife held in public. Her existence erased the possibility of replacing her. She was the face of the marriage, the anchor of inheritance, the figure whose very presence reminded everyone where the true boundaries lay. Her appearance also served as a silent warning. When she walked beside her husband at a gathering, the court understood that whatever happened behind closed doors had no bearing on the visible order of their lives. Her calm eyes conveyed a message sharper than anger. She remained the woman whose name followed his in legal documents, whose children would inherit his position, whose status could not be altered by desire or rumor. The mistress might influence private hours, but the wife commanded the public sphere, where real power still resided. The mistress felt this presence acutely, even when observing from afar. She never entered the spaces where the wife reigned. She heard descriptions instead. Stories of the wife's poise, her gowns, the way she held herself with quiet certainty. These accounts reminded the mistress of the distance she could never cross. The wife's visibility was not merely ceremonial. It was a boundary that delineated who belonged to the household's future and who remained a fleeting shadow within its walls. Servants, too, recognized the authority embedded in the wife's presence. In her chambers, they spoke more cautiously. In her hallways, they walked more deliberately. They understood that her approval shaped their routines, and her displeasure, even unspoken, could alter their standing. They respected the mistress in private, perhaps, but they obeyed the wife in every sphere touched by daylight. Her presence defined the manor's center of gravity. The wife herself understood this dynamic intimately. Presence was her weapon, her shield, and her final claim to a life that often felt hollow. She walked into rooms with the knowledge that her existence alone stabilized the fragile balance threatened by her husband's hidden choices. She represented what could not be erased, what could not be replaced, and what the household depended upon to maintain its order. Her quiet steps through formal spaces carried more authority than any spoken challenge. They served as a constant reminder of the structure that governed every life inside the household. Beyond that composed exterior, a subtle current began to suggest that presence alone might no longer be enough to hold the shifting tensions at bay. Secrecy shaped every aspect of the mistress's existence, becoming both her shield and her only form of influence. She understood from the moment she entered the household, whether through a lingering glance or a whispered invitation, that her power did not resemble the wife's lawful authority. It lived in the shadows, in the careful restraint of her gestures, in the soft edges of her presence that never pressed too hard. What drew the man toward her was not something the world could measure, but something that thrived precisely because it remained concealed. Her allure depended on silence, on the absence of claims, on the illusion that she existed outside the burdens of duty. Each time she met the husband in private chambers or quiet corners of the manor, She carried herself with a softness designed to avoid friction. She offered no demands, no expectations, no questions that tied him to responsibility. This lightness, strategic, deliberate, granted her a subtle influence. He sought her because she provided a different world, one where he could shed the formality required beside his wife and indulge in the comfort of unspoken understanding. Yet even in these moments, she was acutely aware that her position depended on how carefully she maintained her restraint. She never displayed affection in ways that might be interpreted as boldness. Emotions, when shown too openly, risked resembling claims. A lingering touch, a smile held too long, a tone marked with longing. Each carried the potential to unsettle the delicate arrangement. She learned to temper her reactions, offering warmth without grasping, attention without expectation. Her silence did not signify a lack of feeling. It signified the boundaries she could not cross. She existed in a role that demanded intimacy without possession, tenderness without recognition, devotion without security. Publicly, she disappeared into the background. She understood that her power existed only where the wife's gaze could not reach. Her steps were soft, her entrances quiet, her presence adjusted to match the rhythm of secrecy. She dressed well enough to please the man, but not so elegantly as to provoke comparison. She attended to herself with care, but avoided flourishes that suggested audacity. Every choice she made, fabric, hairstyle, jewelry, was calculated to preserve the illusion that she was present only by circumstance, not by design. Her influence lay in the private moments where the husband chose her. That choice, repeated quietly over time, shaped the emotional landscape of the household. She did not need titles or rooms of her own. Her power was woven into the attention he gave her and the comfort he sought from her company. Yet this same influence was fragile. It depended entirely on being wanted. Without that desire, her place vanished. She knew this too clearly, and the knowledge carved a hollow space inside her, one she never allowed the man to see. Despite the precariousness of her position, she was not without agency. Her silence allowed her to observe the wife, the servants, the husband, each from a distance that protected her from judgment. She learned to read the household's pulse, sensing shifts in mood or routine before others noticed them. This awareness became a quiet leverage. She anticipated what the man needed, when he would retreat, when he would seek her presence. She adjusted herself accordingly, bending without breaking. Still, the limits of her life pressed against her. She could not walk through the manor freely without stirring discomfort. She could not join the family at meals or stand beside her husband during gatherings. She could not request anything that might reveal her hopes. Even her happiness was conditional, granted only in secret. She belonged to the margins, where affection felt vivid yet weightless, never grounded in anything she could claim. The wife, though bound by her own restrictions, felt the mistress's presence as an intrusion. However silent, she recognized the artful restraint, the hidden strength in the other woman's ability to become essential without appearing disruptive. This quiet influence unsettled her far more than open disobedience ever could. The wife relied on visibility, the mistress relied on absence. Their opposing forms of control shaped a tension neither dared express. For the mistress, the greatest danger lay in forgetting her place. She reminded herself daily that secrecy was her lifeline. Mystery was her safeguard, the very quality that allowed her presence to remain tolerable. Without it, she risked provoking confrontation or suspicion. Her world could shatter with a single misstep. A careless expression, an overheard word, a moment of boldness mistaken for entitlement. Her survival depended on a delicate poise that hid longing behind restraint. It revealed how influence could thrive in silence while remaining perilously fragile. Through the measured quiet she maintained, A growing uncertainty hinted that secrecy alone might not contain what was beginning to unfold. Unwritten rules governed the Tudor household with a severity that surpassed anything preserved in ink. These rules drifted through corridors like invisible sentinels, shaping behavior with a force no decree could match. Everyone understood them: wife, mistress, husband, our servants, though none would dare recite them aloud. Breaking them did not invite formal trials or courtroom judgment. The punishment arrived more swiftly, carried out by society itself. Reputation acted as both executioner and witness, stripping dignity from anyone who stepped beyond the boundaries that tradition imposed. The wife lived under these rules with an awareness sharpened by experience. She knew that if she faltered, if she displayed jealousy too openly, if she confronted her husband before the wrong audience, if she let anger slip through her careful restraint, her standing could collapse in an instant. Society relied heavily on her composure. People expected her to represent stability, to uphold the facade of an orderly marriage even when cracks widened beneath the surface. Should she violate this expectation, the consequences would fall upon her, not her husband. Rumors would tighten around her like a noose, suggesting she was emotional, weak, or incapable of managing her household. Her duty was not merely to endure, but to endure without appearing wounded. The mistress lived under a different but equally unforgiving set of laws. Her existence was already precarious, and any misstep would magnify her vulnerability. Should she dare appear in public beside the man, or allow her clothing to rival the wife's, or speak with a familiarity that hinted at possession, she would invite a kind of social contempt that had no remedy. People would whisper her name with disdain. Servants would refuse to meet her eyes, and she could be dismissed without warning. The man who once sought her company might abandon her to protect his own reputation. The household would close its doors behind her, as though she had never existed. Society punished subtle transgressions with startling speed. A single misinterpreted gesture at a feast, a glance held too long, a word spoken with the wrong tone. Each could spark a story that multiplied through kitchens, taverns, and church pews until it became a weapon. Those stories did not fade. They clung to their subjects, reshaping how others saw them, turning once respected figures into warnings. No one understood this better than the servants, who carried gossip like embers, capable of igniting a fire at any moment. They did not speak to the wife or the mistress directly. Instead, they shared their observations in coded conversation, spreading information along invisible lines. When a rule was broken, however subtly, the servants were the first to sense the shift. They felt it in the atmosphere of the household, in hurried footsteps, in tightened voices, in objects moved abruptly from their usual places. They rarely judged. Judgment belonged to those above them. But they recognized the unfolding of consequences long before it reached its full form. The husband, though shielded from most repercussions, was not entirely exempt. His infidelity was tolerated, but flaunting it could threaten alliances and draw scrutiny from those who valued appearances above truth. Should he elevate the mistress too openly, or neglect the wife in public view, he risked losing the respect of peers whose approval mattered deeply. Yet even then, the punishment he faced paled beside the harshness directed at the women entangled in his choices. These unwritten laws thrived precisely because they required no enforcement. Each person internalized them from youth, learning through observation how swiftly society turned against those who strayed too far from its expectations. A woman's downfall could be sudden and irreversible. One moment, she occupied a place of dignity. The next, she was marked by the echo of a whisper that spread faster than she could defend herself. Many learned too late that silence had been safer than truth. The wife felt this threat each day, aware that her marriage, its fractures, tensions, and hidden wounds, existed under the gaze of those ready to critique her every movement. She carried herself with precision, not because she lacked feeling, but because feeling had no place in the world she inhabited. The mistress felt it too, sensing the precariousness of her role in every glance cast in her direction. Their lives were intertwined not by affection or rivalry, but by the shared knowledge that society would show neither mercy should they step beyond the shadowy confines of what was permissible. Every Tudor household held stories of women whose reputations had collapsed under the weight of rumours, whose names faded into cautionary tales. These stories lingered in the background like ghosts, reminding both wife and mistress that survival depended on obedience to rules never spoken, yet universally understood. Such unspoken expectations revealed how punishment could emerge without warning, carried not by law, but by judgment. They exposed the fragile security both women clung to within a world that offered neither of them true protection. Amid the tension shaped by these unseen dangers, a feeling began to stir that the balance sustained by silence could fracture under the weight of its own cruelty. The birth of a son altered the entire structure of the household with a force no one dared name aloud. It settled over the manor like a shift in gravity, subtle at first, then undeniable. For the wife, long confined to restraint and quiet endurance, the infant in her arms became more than a child. He was legitimately made flesh, a living shield against uncertainty, the one thing no mistress, no matter how beloved, could offer in equal measure. Through him, her position settled into a solidity that felt at once empowering and unbearably fragile, as though she held power only by holding him close. She felt it in the way servants' voices softened when they approached her chamber, in the way neighbours sent gifts wrapped in cloth embroidered with blessings, in the way her husband's family spoke to her with a new, measured respect. These people had always demanded her composure, her obedience, her silence, but now they greeted her as someone who mattered in a way they could not overlook. Her son was not simply a child, he was the continuation of a name, the answer to a lineage, the promise of stability. Through him, she moved from tolerated to necessary. Her husband, too, behaved differently. He visited her more often during the early weeks. Not out of tenderness, she had long abandoned the hope of that, but out of recognition. She had given him what society valued most, a male heir. His approval, once distant and irregular, came now in brief nods, softened expressions, moments of acknowledgement that felt almost foreign. Yet, the wife sensed the limits of this shift. His attention remained conditional, tied not to her as a woman, but to her role as the mother of his future successor. Still, even conditional respect offered her more stability than she had ever possessed. The mistress, however, felt the consequence, unseen by others, but impossible for her to ignore. Her presence, once sought after with restless desire, became increasingly hidden in the shadows. She understood immediately that her influence had fractured. The man's gaze, once unwavering, now drifted more cautiously, as if the simple act of seeking her company carried new weight. Every visit he made to her chamber felt stolen, tinged with hesitation rather than hunger. Her position had always been precarious, built on secrecy, sustained by choice rather than duty. But now that a son existed, that choice grew less necessary. The wife had provided something the mistress never could, something society valued beyond affection, beyond desire, beyond secrecy. The mistress did not resent the child, she resented what he represented, a boundary she could never cross. She watched from afar as the wife's status swelled, as her own world shrank quietly around her, and she could not escape the knowledge that she might soon be dismissed. Servants felt the shift as well. Their deference toward the wife grew more pronounced. Their whispers about the mistress became sharper at the edges. Some avoided looking at her altogether, as though already preparing for her absence. They had learned through generations of observation that mistresses without leverage rarely remained long. And leverage, in this world, meant heirs. For the wife, the newborn's presence reshaped her internal landscape as much as it transformed her external standing. She held the child in the dim hours of morning and felt, for the first time in years, a quiet sense of victory, not triumph over the mistress, though the shift in their positions was undeniable, but triumph over the instability that had once defined her life. She no longer feared that she might be replaced, ignored, or diminished. Her son secured her place in the house's future in a way nothing else could. Still, she did not allow herself to forget the fragility hidden inside every Tudor privilege. A single illness, a misfortune, a whisper of scandal could undo all she had gained. She carried her child with both devotion and vigilance, understanding that her newfound security depended on his survival, his health, and his future role. The burden was immense, yet she accepted it with a determination born from years of silent endurance. Meanwhile, the mistress clung to the remnants of her influence with a grace that concealed her fear. She tried to maintain the softness that once drew the husband toward her, offering no complaint, no confrontation. But inside, she felt time gathering against her. With each passing day, the household tightened around the new mother and son, leaving her on the outer edges of a life she once shaped in secret. Her future, once fluid, now felt like a narrowing corridor with no clear direction. The husband sensed all of this, but chose not to address it. His world operated within rules that required no explanation. A son meant legacy. Legacy demanded stability. Stability fortified the wife. These truths were as ancient as the walls of the manor, and he moved within them without questioning their weight. Her strengthened position revealed how quickly a single child could redirect the household's loyalties. It exposed the quiet unraveling of bonds that once felt certain to endure. Through that shifting silence, a troubling hint emerged that another birth might carry consequences no one was prepared to face. A child born in secrecy carried a weight, neither tender nor simple, reshaping the household with a quiet force that no ceremony ever acknowledged. The mistress understood this long before her labor pains began. She knew her child would never stand in the sunlight of legitimacy, never be announced to the manor with bells or feasts, never be cradled before noble guests as a symbol of lineage. And yet, as she held the newborn against her chest, she felt a fierce, trembling certainty. This small life, though unclaimed in public, anchored her to the man in ways more binding than affection alone. The household sensed the change even before the husband arrived to see the child. Servants walked with a hush around her chamber, their eyes quick to shift away, as though witnessing the existence of the baby violated some boundary they were sworn not to cross. Their silence was not unkind, but it held a cold understanding. This child belonged to no official world. He would not bear a title, nor inherit land, nor sit in a grand hall beside his father. He existed in a liminal space, suspended between acceptance and denial, between bloodline and invisibility. The husband's first visit came in the evening, when shadows blurred the edges of the room. He stood beside the mistress with a tired relief that betrayed more emotion than he intended to show. His gaze softened as he looked at the infant, tracing features that echoed his own. Yet when he reached out to touch the child, hesitation flickered through him, a reminder that this moment had no rightful place in the order of things. What he felt could never be fully expressed, because acknowledging too much would threaten the structure that protected his name. He murmured a few words that sounded almost like approval. Then he stepped back, distancing himself as though proximity alone might endanger everyone involved. The mistress felt the shift instantly. Her child had been recognized privately, but never would he be welcomed openly. She knew better than to ask for more. Still, The faint warmth of that quiet acknowledgement lingered inside her, a fragile thread she tried not to hold too tightly. The wife, though never shown the child, learned of his birth through the subtle machinery of household whispers, a servant's tightened expression, a door left ajar, a fleeting glance exchanged in the corridor. These fragments carried the truth to her with a precision that words did not require. She felt the weight of the news settle on her shoulders like a familiar shadow. The mistress's child did not threaten her son's inheritance, but it unsettled the balance she fought so hard to maintain. Her composure did not crack. She continued her days with the same deliberate grace, the same measured steps, the same unwavering presence at meals and ceremonies. Yet in the quiet hours, she recognized the deeper implication. The mistress now shared a bond with the husband that was no longer ephemeral. A child, even one without legitimate status, altered emotional terrain. It created a tether that secrecy alone could not erase. Still, the wife understood that society would never allow this new life to outrank her own children. The law, custom, and expectations of every noble household stood firmly at her side. Her position remained secure, protected by marriage and lineage. But security did not ease the ache of humiliation. Another woman had delivered something intimate, something elemental, something she preferred to believe belonged only within her chambers. The mistress, meanwhile, lived with a dual reality. In private moments, she held her child with a tenderness untouched by fear, whispering promises she knew she might never fulfill. In public, or rather, in the narrow slivers of the household where she was allowed to appear, she carried herself with even greater restraint. Any hint of pride could be mistaken for ambition. Any expression of attachment could be seen as provocation. She hid her joy as carefully as she had once hidden her sorrow. Her child grew within a world both connected and excluded. Servants treated him with a gentleness that avoided implication, neither elevating nor diminishing him. The husband visited when he could, always under the cover of darkness, always silently. He brought small gifts, a carved wooden toy, a soft blanket, and an herbal remedy for fever, but never anything that bore the family crest. The child was his, yet could not be marked as such. Between these quiet acts of acknowledgement and denial, the mistress found herself suspended between gratitude and grief. She had gained something precious, yet it deepened her isolation. Her future, already uncertain, became a narrow path defined by what she could not request, could not demand, could not hope for openly, and the child, too young to understand the world's boundaries, became a mirror of everything unspoken, a symbol of desire, consequence, and the fragile webs spun between women who never chose to share a life, yet were bound by the same man's decisions. Such a birth revealed how a single moment could deepen both connection and exile, binding hearts through a secret that could never be named aloud. It exposed the quiet ache carried by those who lived in the margins of legitimacy, where affection lacked protection. Amid the delicate balance surrounding the newborn's existence, a subtle tension suggested that this fragile quiet might not endure untouched. Competition between the wife and the mistress unfolded in a silence so refined that outsiders rarely recognized it for what it was. No raised voices, no accusations, no sharp exchanges disturbed the surface of the Tudor household. Instead, the rivalry lived in smaller spaces, in lingering glances, in the curvature of a gesture, in pauses too slight to name. The tension did not depend on speech. Words would have shattered the delicate order both women were forced to obey. Their power, such as it was, appeared instead in subtleties that revealed far more than any declaration. The wife learned early how to command a room with nothing but her posture. When she entered a hall, she did not need to speak for others to shift their attention. She carried herself with a stillness sharpened by expectation, moving with precision as though each step confirmed her rightful authority. Her chin held at a measured height, her hands steady at her sides, her gaze moving slowly across faces. These gestures reminded everyone of the place she occupied. She was the lawful wife, the guardian of lineage, the woman whose presence defined the household's hierarchy. When the mistress appeared at the edges of the same room, she moved differently. She never sought the center. Her power existed in the margins. Her steps were soft, almost hesitant, yet precisely controlled. She avoided drawing attention, but her very restraint created a quiet allure that the husband found difficult to resist. She glanced only briefly in the wife's direction, not long enough to provoke, but enough to register a truth the two women shared. Proximity itself was a kind of confrontation, though they rarely exchanged words. The awareness between them was unmistakable. Each recognized the other as an unavoidable presence in a life neither had chosen. In ceremonies, the unspoken competition intensified. The wife always stood in the position closest to the husband, the place reserved by law and custom. Her placement conveyed legitimacy so clearly that no one questioned it. Yet the mistress, positioned far behind or off to the side, understood her location as a message. She was wanted, but never officially. She existed just beyond the radius of respectability. Still, she felt the husband's glances drift toward her at unexpected moments. These subtle acknowledgements created ripples of tension that only the two women could decipher. Sometimes, the wife noticed those glances. Never openly. Never with visible reaction, but with a tightening of the shoulders or a brief stillness of breath. She understood that expressing jealousy would betray the self-control expected of her. So she concealed every flicker of feeling beneath an unmoving exterior. Yet she felt each glance as a small fracture, as a reminder that her position, though secured by law, could never guarantee emotional loyalty. The mistress, for her part, felt both empowered and trapped by those moments. The glance affirmed her importance, yet it also exposed her to scrutiny. She knew the wife saw more than she allowed herself to reveal, and because the mistress could never stand beside the husband, those fleeting signs of his attention became her only public proof of influence. Still, she kept her face composed, offering nothing that could be interpreted as boldness. Her restraint was both a weapon and a defense. Beyond physical placement, rivalry also unfolded in the ways people spoke of each woman when she was not present. Servants referred to the wife with titles. Her ladyship, the mistress of the house, phrases that reinforced her authority. They spoke her name with a formality that acknowledged her central role. But when discussing the mistress, their voices shifted. They used descriptions rather than titles. The young woman, the one he visits, the quiet one. Their words did not dismiss her entirely, but they made clear the boundaries of her place. She existed in conversation the same way she existed in the household, present, but unanchored. Yet the husband's speech, though guarded, held its own truth. When he referred to the wife, it was almost always in matters of responsibility, household affairs, alliance, and lineage. When he mentioned the mistress, it was in softer tones, with a subtle warmth that betrayed emotional attachment. These differences did not escape either woman. The wife felt the weight of duty in every conversation. The mistress felt the ache of being desired without ever being chosen publicly. Their rivalry was not fought in obvious ways. It lived in the silence between footsteps, in the measured distance they kept in corridors, in the rare moments when their eyes met and lingered just long enough to acknowledge shared suffering. Each woman learned to read the other through these fragments, through the tension of proximity, through the restraint required by a world that denied them any confrontation. Neither could claim victory. The wife held legitimacy, security, and social standing. Yet she carried the burden of watching her husband's affections stray. The mistress held the man's desire. Yet she lived without safety, without recognition, without a future she could rely on. Their competition persisted not because either sought to defeat the other, but because they were bound to a structure that forced them into parallel roles, existing separately, yet always measured against one another. Such quiet rivalry revealed how power could shift without a single word, shaping lives through glances rather than declarations. It exposed the intricate choreography two women were forced to perform under the weight of expectations neither had chosen. Through the strained calm that hovered between them, a faint suggestion rose that unspoken tension might one day push beyond the boundaries both had learned to obey. Victory in the Tudor household never belonged to the heart. It belonged to endurance. Quiet, disciplined, and often brutal. Both the wife and the mistress learned this truth long before they admitted it to themselves. Affection could shift overnight. Desire could fade without warning. But survival demanded something far colder. The woman who remained was not the one most cherished, but the one who understood how to outlast the shifting moods of a man and the harsher judgment of society. The wife, bound by law and lineage, had always known that love held no promise for her, even before her wedding day. She understood that her marriage represented an alliance rather than a tender union. What sustained her position was not sentiment, but stability. She learned to regulate her voice, to smooth her expression into calm neutrality, to move through the manner with the measured grace expected of someone who symbolized order. Her success lay in her ability to disturb nothing, to maintain decorum even when turbulence simmered beneath the surface of her life. Her endurance became a strategy. She understood that husbands grew bored, that mistresses came and went, that affection wandered like a restless flame. But the wife remained because she represented continuity. Her power grew not from being chosen emotionally, but from being required structurally. She learned the rhythm of patience, of withholding reaction, of allowing time to settle what outrage might disrupt. Each day, she perfected the art of not giving anyone, husband, to servants, or rivals, a reason to question her steadiness. The mistress, on the other hand, learned to survive through delicacy rather than permanence. Her power depended not on status, but on interpretation. She recognized early that she could not afford to provoke tension, challenge authority, or demand too much. To remain, she needed to embody a kind of soft presence that soothed rather than unsettled. Her quietness was not timidity. It was an intentional weapon sharpened by circumstance. She survived by offering ease where the wife embodied duty, by presenting herself as a refuge from expectation rather than an alternative to it. Yet she knew her position was inherently unstable. A moment of jealousy, a careless word, a misunderstanding could unravel everything she had built in silence. So she learned the rules of discretion with a precision born of necessity. She kept her emotions contained, her desires unspoken, her presence light enough to avoid accusation, but steady enough to remain desired. If the wife endured through structure, the mistress endured through softness, each navigating the same man's world by opposite means. Both women felt the passage of time differently. For the wife, each year solidified her claim. Growing older did not diminish her standing. It reinforced her place at the center of the household. Her endurance accumulated like layers of stone, building an unshakable foundation. The mistress, however, lived with the constant knowledge that youth fueled her influence. Time pressed against her more urgently, tightening her future into a narrow corridor. She knew she could not remain forever. She could only remain longer than those who came before or after her. What neither woman admitted aloud was that victory was rarely visible. Winning meant continuing, not in triumph, but in persistence. The wife won when she held her place despite her husband's infidelities. The mistress won when she retained his attention without crossing forbidden boundaries. Their victories were measured not in affection, but in survival. Quiet, sustained, and often lonely. Their rivalry, though silent, carved itself into the rhythms of the household. Servants learned to read who was gaining or losing ground, not by what was said, but by what went unsaid. A place at a table, a glance exchanged during a feast, a delay in a visit, a gesture of acknowledgement. Each revealed the subtle power shifts that neither woman could afford to discuss. The wife noticed when the mistress appeared less frequently. The mistress noticed when the wife grew more vigilant, and each understood that the other was waiting for signs of weakness. What bound them together was a truth neither could escape. They were both navigating a world defined by a man's choices, yet judged entirely by their ability to manage those choices without complaint. The wife hid her wounds behind dignity. The mistress hid hers behind softness. Neither loved the circumstances they lived in, and neither believed love would save them. Victory meant remaining after storms others could not weather. It meant mastering silence, absorbing humiliation, and protecting oneself without appearing defensive. It meant knowing when to retreat, when to endure, when to pretend not to notice the things that cut deepest. Love had little to do with it. Survival belonged to the woman who adapted with the fewest visible tremors. Such endurance revealed how triumph in this world grew from resilience rather than affection. Rewarding the one who learned to bend without breaking, it exposed the quiet calculations woven into every gesture, every pause, every unspoken concession that determined who stayed and who vanished. As the strained calm settled around their unspoken rivalry, a faint disturbance hinted that the fragile balance they relied upon might shift in ways neither woman could fully foresee. Endurance became the wife's most cultivated skill, a quiet discipline shaped long before she even entered the marriage. From childhood, she had been taught that her value rested not in desire or affection, but in stability, her ability to withstand discomfort without allowing it to disturb the order around her. By the time she took her place as the household's lawful woman, she understood that suffering was not merely an unfortunate part of her role. It was the very language she was expected to speak. She endured to keep her position secure. Every noble marriage demanded that the wife remain composed, even when her husband's attentions drifted elsewhere. The presence of a mistress, though painful, did not release her from her duties. Instead, it tightened them. Her lineage, her dowry, her alliances. These were the elements that legitimized the household structure. To fail publicly, to react too strongly, to allow her emotions to surface, would risk eroding the very foundation she represented. So she learned to swallow indignities with a collected expression, understanding that silence preserved her power more effectively than confrontation ever could. Her endurance deepened when she became a mother. The birth of her children, especially a son, wove her identity into the future of the family. She no longer endured solely for herself. She endured for those who depended on her presence, her grace, her careful control of the world around them. Every choice she made was shaped by the desire to shield them from scandal or instability. Even the smallest misstep could endanger their prospects. Thus, she carried the weight of responsibility with a stillness that masked the fierce protectiveness circulating beneath her calm exterior. Her suffering became a strategic act, a silent negotiation between her inner world and the expectations that confined her. She often found herself awake in the early hours, staring at the dim glow of a dying candle, allowing herself to feel what she could never express, the humiliation of knowing her husband sought comfort elsewhere, the loneliness of standing beside him in public while his affections roamed beyond her reach, the exhaustion of maintaining poise for an audience that mistook her composure for indifference. In those hours, she allowed herself to grieve, not because it changed anything, but because it reminded her that she was still human beneath the roles she inhabited. Yet she never let grief interfere with performance. Each morning, she rose with a renewed precision, stepping back into her public self with practiced ease. Her endurance was not passive. It required vigilance. She monitored her gestures, controlled her breathing, adjusted her tone, and calculated the impact of each word. She did not merely endure, she honed endurance into influence. People trusted her steadiness. Servants brought concerns to her first. Relatives sought her opinion before making decisions. Even the husband, despite his infidelities, recognized the order she sustained. In this way, her endurance shaped the household far more profoundly than his authority did. Still, there were moments when endurance felt like an unbearable cage. During gatherings, she sometimes caught sight of the mistress standing quietly in the background. Eyes lowered, posture soft. The sight stirred something sharp in her chest. Not jealousy alone, but the ache of displacement. She had done everything expected of her. Yet here stood a reminder that duty offered no immunity from emotional pain. She turned her face away each time, preserving the facade. But the wound deepened nonetheless. She also recognized that endurance required constant adaptation. Some days demanded strict composure, others called for subtle assertion. She learned to intervene without appearing forceful, to guide conversations without drawing attention, to protect her children while maintaining dignity. These adjustments formed a delicate choreography, one that required intuition and restraint in equal measure. Society praised her for qualities. It forced her to develop. People admired her serenity, her discipline, her unwavering presence. They did not see the cost extracted beneath the surface. The swallowed words, the stiffened shoulders, the nights spent pretending the ache had faded. Her endurance became both her armor and her burden. A quiet triumph, visible only in the stability she maintained. The husband, though rarely aware of the full extent of her internal landscape, benefited from it almost unconsciously. Her steadiness protected him from scandal, preserved alliances, and softened the consequences of his own impulsiveness. He may not have loved her as she once hoped, but he relied on her in ways he never acknowledged aloud. That reliance, though subtle, granted her a form of influence stronger than affection. Endurance, for her, was not about weakness. It was survival shaped into elegance, pain refined into control. She bore what she must, because it allowed her to remain at the center of the life she had been given, protecting her children and preserving the dignity she believed they deserved. Such quiet perseverance revealed how strength could disguise itself as stillness, allowing her to command a world that never invited her voice. It exposed the complex truth that suffering, when carried with intention, could transform into an instrument of subtle authority. Through the fragile calm that followed her practiced restraint, a soft undercurrent suggested that endurance might soon confront pressures it could no longer contain. The mistress lived within an invisible set of boundaries, each one as rigid as the stone walls of the manor. Though no one ever spoke of them openly, she understood these limits instinctively, as if the air around her carried warnings she could not ignore. Her presence depended on compliance, measured, careful, and always restrained. To step beyond what was permitted meant risking everything she had managed to hold together in the shadows. One of the clearest boundaries concerned the husband's legitimate children. She could never intrude upon them, never assume a role that suggested authority or influence. Even speaking their names with too much familiarity felt dangerous. The wife controlled that sphere entirely, and society upheld her dominion with iron certainty. The mistress's affection for the husband did not extend to his heirs, nor could it. To interfere, even unintentionally, would imply a claim she was forbidden to express. She watched the children from afar, curious, perhaps wistful, but remained a ghost in their world, noticed only by servants who understood the delicacy of the situation. This separation wounded her more deeply than she allowed herself to admit. Sometimes the husband spoke of his children with a softened expression, and she listened with quiet longing, knowing she could never share in that part of his life. She knew that her own child, if she had one, would inhabit a different, dimmer world, acknowledged privately, at best, erased publicly without hesitation. She accepted this truth not because it was fair, but because rejecting it would shatter the fragile ground beneath her feet. Another boundary haunted her even more. She could never ask for marriage. To voice such a desire would render her foolish, presumptuous, even dangerous. The husband might care for her, might seek her out in stolen hours, might whisper words that felt tender enough to build hope. But none of it translated into promise. She learned early that a mistress survived not by being loved deeply, but by never demanding more than the man was willing or able to give. Marriage belonged to women with lineage, dowries, alliances, and women whose existence benefited the household structure. She was not one of them. The mistress carried this truth silently, shaping herself around it. She avoided conversations that hinted at permanence. She did not ask about the future. She did not linger too long after moments of closeness. She understood that desire, when expressed openly, could harden into threat. Her influence thrived only when it remained weightless, without expectation. To ask for marriage, or even to imply she wanted such a union, would risk transforming her from a comfort into a complication, the most perilous boundary of all. However, was the prohibition against public challenge. She could never confront her wife. She could never compete openly. She could never allow any gesture to suggest she believed herself equal. Her world existed in the margins, present but not visible, wanted but not acknowledged. If she allowed emotion to pierce the surface of this delicate arrangement, she would become the problem others sought to eliminate. Respectability in Tudor society was not merely a virtue, it was a weapon, and the mistress had no protection against it. She remained attentive to every detail that might betray her feelings. When the wife entered a room, the mistress lowered her gaze. When the husband and wife stood together at ceremonies, she receded into the background. Even her clothing reflected caution, fine enough to please him, modest enough not to provoke comparison. She walked a narrow path, careful to remain soft, obedient to unspoken rules, shaped by the quiet fear that one misstep could end her presence entirely. Yet within these confines, she developed a kind of silent resilience. Her survival depended on reading emotions before they surfaced, anticipating shifts in the household's atmosphere, and adjusting her actions to avoid tension. She understood that the wife's suffering carried its own sharp edges, and she avoided crossing into the wife's domain with a precision born of intuition rather than instruction. In this way, she became both vulnerable and adept, navigating a world that granted her desire but denied her legitimacy. At times, the husband's affection complicated everything. He visited her with a longing that felt genuine, yet his words often failed to acknowledge the chains around her life. He sought comfort, closeness, and softness, unaware of the balancing act she performed to make those moments possible. She knew that if she allowed him to see the full weight she carried, the fragile peace between them might fracture. So she kept her voice gentle, her questions few, her disappointment hidden behind practiced smiles. Despite her restraint, she felt the ache of her position more deeply as time passed. She lived in the household, yet belonged nowhere within it. She loved a man she could never claim. She bore the consequences of choices she did not make. Her life became a study in contradiction, cherished in private, dismissed in public, necessary to him, expendable to everyone else. Her limits were cruel in their clarity, but she obeyed them because they offered the only path to remaining by his side. Breaking them meant vanishing from his life entirely, replaced by another, whose silence and softness could be molded anew. She knew this, feared it, and shaped every gesture around the desire to remain present a little longer. Such boundaries revealed how her survival depended not on passion, but on restraint, requiring her to master the art of disappearing at the very moment she was most desired. They exposed the quiet suffering of a woman forced to navigate love without permission, devotion without security, presence without recognition. Beneath the fragile order she upheld, a subtle tremor hinted that these limits, once unbreakable, might soon be strained by forces neither woman could fully control. Violation of an unwritten rule did not begin with noise. It began with a tremor, small, nearly invisible, spreading quietly through the household long before anyone dared name its cause. Servants moved differently in the corridors, their steps sharper, their glances more evasive. Conversations shortened abruptly when certain doors opened. The wife sensed it first, not through words, but through an instinct honed by years of navigating a world where silence carried more danger than speech. Something had shifted, and whatever it was, she understood it would not remain contained for long. The scandal erupted slowly. Then all at once, a misplaced gesture, a moment of indulgence, a careless appearance in the wrong company. Whatever the origin, it created a breach too wide to mend. The husband and mistress had been seen together beyond the privacy that once shielded them. Perhaps it was a lingering touch during a feast, noticed by more than one pair of eyes. Perhaps a servant caught them in a room meant for others. Perhaps the wife's relatives heard a rumor at court, whispered behind a fan, but loud enough to wound. The details varied depending on who told the story, but the outcome was the same. The boundary between secrecy and exposure had been crossed. Once the rumor found air, it spread with a speed neither woman could control. Servants repeated it in kitchens and stables. Neighbours murmured it in parlours. Courtiers, always hungry for intrigue, carried it from hall to hall, weaving embellishments into every retelling. Each repetition stripped away another layer of the household's dignity, until the truth, whatever it had originally been, no longer mattered. Scandal had taken shape, and scandal obeyed no master. The wife felt the blow with a cold clarity. For years, she had endured quietly, preserving her composure while the world looked to her for stability. Now that composure seemed weaponized against her. People who once greeted her with respect now watched her with an unsettling mixture of pity and curiosity. She felt herself becoming a story, un spectacle, a warning. Her suffering, so carefully hidden, now lived beneath the scrutiny of those who judged her for failing to maintain control over her own household. She did not allow herself to break. She adjusted her posture, refined her voice, kept her gaze unwavering, even while an ache pressed heavily against her ribs. But her dignity, once a shield, now felt like thin parchment stretched over fracture lines. She stood beside her husband during ceremonies with more precision than ever, aware that every gesture would be interpreted as retaliation or resignation. Endurance, once her power, had become a test with no clear end. The husband, though at the centre of the scandal, bore less visible damage. Society condemned him without consequence. His error was acknowledged with raised brows and subtle disapproval. But the greater portion of blame fell upon the mistress, as it always did. He himself felt shaken, not by shame, but by the sudden realization that his private desires had collided with the expectations that protected his public life. He had disrupted the order he relied on, and in doing so, endangered the stability he assumed would always remain intact. But the mistress suffered most deeply. Overnight, her world narrowed into a corridor of fear and uncertainty. The glances once cast toward her with curiosity now brimmed with condemnation. People spoke her name with disdain, branding her reckless, ambitious, Disrespectful. She felt the judgment in every turned shoulder, every averted gaze, every whispered conversation that fell silent when she entered a room. She had been tolerated as long as she remained invisible. Once visibility arrived, even unintentionally, it marked her as a threat that needed to be removed. She tried to retreat into the softness that once protected her, but the scandal swallowed her attempts. Her presence, once quietly accepted, became a reminder of disorder. The husband visited her less often, his steps heavy with caution rather than longing. When he did speak, his words were restrained, shaped by fear rather than affection. For the first time, she saw how fragile her place truly was. All the restraint she had practiced meant little now that whispers had cast her into the light she never sought. She felt herself fading from his life with an inevitability she could not bear to name. The household itself bent under the strain. Conversations grew tense. Rituals faltered. The once steady rhythm of daily life warped around the scandal's echo. Every person, wife, husband, or mistress carried a different version of the fallout. The wife bore humiliation. The mistress bore blame. The husband bore the inconvenience. Together, they formed a triangle whose fractures reached into every corner of the manor. There was no resolution, only consequences. Scandal did not end through apology or explanation. It settled over them like fog, reshaping futures, altering alliances, carving wounds that would not heal cleanly. Some whispered that the mistress would be dismissed. Others speculated that the wife might retreat from public life. Still others predicted that the husband would attempt to restore order through gestures of false repentance. None of these predictions mattered. The truth was simpler and harsher. When an unwritten rule was broken, no one emerged untouched. Such a rupture revealed how a single moment could dismantle the fragile balance that held their lives in place, stripping away illusions of control. It exposed the harsh truth that silence, once a shield, could turn swiftly into a blade when boundaries collapsed. Among the lingering tension that settled over the household, a quiet shift suggested that the aftermath would reshape more than reputations. It would alter the very structure of their world. Echoed. Silence settled over the household with a heaviness that felt almost physical, as if the walls themselves refused to carry sound. No accusations were spoken. No confrontations erupted. Yet the absence of words pressed harder against each person than anger ever could. Silence had become the chosen response, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. And in its restrained stillness, it revealed itself to be the most devastating force of all. The wife understood this instinctively. She had long practiced the discipline of holding her tongue. But now her silence shifted into something sharper. She did not weep or raise her voice or seek reassurance. Instead, she tightened her composure to the point of fracture. Her quietness no longer signified endurance. It became a condemnation. Every calm step she took through the manor echoed with the weight of unspoken betrayal. Servants watched her carefully, sensing that her stillness had transformed into a declaration more powerful than speech. She did not need to confront her husband. Her silence did it for her, illuminating every crack in their marriage without uttering a single word. The husband felt the impact more deeply than he expected. He had never feared silence before, but now it pursued him through corridors, across dinner tables, into rooms where the air thinned around him. Her lack of accusation left him without defense. There was nothing to deny, nothing to counter, nothing to justify. Her silence became a mirror, forcing him to see himself without distortion. And because it offered no path toward reconciliation, it left him suspended in uncertainty, unanchored, exposed, unable to restore what had been broken. He preferred anger. Anger he could answer. Silence, however, stripped him bare. For the mistress, silence delivered a different kind of torment. She was not addressed by the wife, nor acknowledged by the husband. nor spoken to by those who once treated her with cautious courtesy. Instead, she became an absence in human form, seen without being invited. I heard about without being included. Conversations halted when she approached. Not out of respect, but avoidance. The household's refusal to speak to her or about her created a vacuum that swallowed her identity. In this forced quiet, she confronted a truth she had long feared. She had no claim to defend herself, no ground from which to speak, no voice that society would recognize. The silence between wife and mistress was the most unbearable of all. They sometimes crossed paths in narrow halls, their eyes meeting briefly before turning away. Neither woman spoke, though each carried enough pain to fill the air between them. The wife's silence condemned, the mistress's silence pleaded, yet neither dared break it. Not because they lacked words, but because the household would collapse under the weight of what might be spoken. Their muteness became a mutual surrender to roles neither chose. Yet both were trapped within. Silence preserved injustice with ruthless efficiency. It allowed the husband to continue his life with minimal disruption. It allowed society to pretend that the scandal had been contained. It allowed the household to resume its rituals as though nothing had happened. Beneath this veneer, however, suffering deepened. The wife's dignity hardened into loneliness. The mistress's isolation swallowed her sense of self. The husband's authority thinned under the strain of unarticulated guilt. Silence helped them avoid chaos. But it offered no healing. It merely prolonged the wound. In gatherings, the wife's controlled quietness became a public performance. She smiled with a gentleness that did not reach her eyes, responded to greetings with precision, and moved with an elegance so flawless it bordered on brittle. People praised her composure, mistaking it for strength. They did not see the tension in her fingers or the stiffness in her breath. They never recognized that her silence was a shield pressed so tightly against her chest it nearly suffocated her. The mistress shrank further into the shadows. Once, her silence had been a strategic softness, a way to survive within boundaries that denied her visibility. Now it has become suffocation. She no longer felt desired or quietly significant. She felt erased, dissolved into the edges of a household that no longer tolerated her presence. Even the husband's visits grew brief and strained, his words clipped by embarrassment and fear of further scandal. His silence toward her inflicted the deepest cut, turning their once secret intimacy into a reminder that she had always been temporary. Silence kept the entire system intact. If the wife spoke, she would be judged. If the mistress spoke, she would be punished. If the husband spoke, he would be forced to face consequences he preferred to avoid. Thus, they all remained quiet, participating in a ritual of restraint that preserved order while destroying them individually. The tragedy lay in how comfortable silence became. The household adjusted to its presence, learned to navigate its contours, and allowed its cruelty to blend into daily routine. No one questioned it because questioning required courage none of them could afford. So they bore the stillness, letting it settle into their bones, shaping their days into muted repetitions of what life had been before, but now hollowed out, stripped of tenderness, stripped of truth. Such muteness revealed how power could hide inside quietness, enabling harm under the guise of maintaining order. It exposed how suffering deepened when no voice was permitted to name it, turning restraint into a slow, relentless fracture through the oppressive calm that now governed their lives. A faint pulse hinted that this silence, so carefully preserved, you might soon give way to consequences none of them could escape. Emotional control had become so deeply ingrained in the wife's life that she no longer remembered when it began, whether it was the day she entered her marriage, or much earlier, when she was still a child being taught how a noble woman must behave. What she did know was that every feeling she possessed now passed through a series of silent filters before it was allowed to appear, if it appeared at all. Joy was softened, anger erased, grief hidden. Her inner world existed behind a veil so finely woven that even she sometimes struggled to see it clearly. Each morning, she rose with the same careful ritual, training her breath into steadiness, arranging her face into calm dignity. Her composure was not vanity, it was survival. A single crack in her expression could be interpreted as weakness, instability, or, worst of all, proof that she no longer deserved the position she held. Her marriage had taught her that the world cared more about how she looked than how she felt, more about what she represented than what she feared. And so, she learned to regulate her emotions with the precision of a scholar copying sacred texts. Letter by letter, line by line, allowing no error. But in this discipline, something essential was slowly stripped away. She lost the right to love freely because love required vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury denied to her. When her husband's attention drifted to the mistress, she could not react. To ask for tenderness would expose need. To express pain would expose humanity. Instead, she built walls inside herself, careful and quiet, until even her longing grew muted. She did not stop loving entirely. Love simply adapted, shrinking into quiet corners where no one could reach it. She also lost the right to be loved. The husband respected her, admired her lineage, and relied on her dignity. But affection belonged to private moments he shared with another woman. The wife understood this without being told. She saw it in the way his eyes softened elsewhere, the way he exhaled in relief when stepping out of the gravity of formal life and into the mistress's quiet softness. The wife was not permitted to grieve this truth. Her role demanded acceptance, not lament. She grew accustomed to being needed, but not cherished. As time passed, she began to sense herself transforming into something symbolic. People saw not a woman but a figure, the lawful wife, the matron, the guardian of lineage. Her identity dissolved into titles, responsibilities, and expectations. Servants bowed to her. Nobles greeted her with deference. Yet none of them seemed to perceive that beneath her composed exterior lived a person who once had dreams small enough to feel real. She felt honored, yet erased. In gatherings, her presence carried weight, but not warmth. She walked through halls where her own footsteps sounded foreign to her. Each ceremony, each formal dinner, each political arrangement reminded her that she had become an emblem, dutiful, polished, and utterly replaceable in her symbolic function. The world admired her role more than her soul, and that realization hollowed her in ways no scandal ever could. Still, she maintained her stillness. She endured the ache without expression, letting it fold into her posture, her silence, her measured gestures. Even on nights when the loneliness pressed heavily against her chest, she lay quietly beside the man who shared her house, but not her heart, knowing that any open sorrow would be dismissed as sentiment unbecoming of someone in her position. Her children became the only place where she allowed fragments of tenderness to survive. With them, she softened her tone, loosened her rigid posture, and allowed traces of warmth to surface. Yet even this came with caution. She worried constantly that her emotional exhaustion might seep into their lives, that they might feel the weight of her restrained grief. So she hid that too, offering them strength she no longer recognized in herself. Over time, her emotional restraint became indistinguishable from silence. She rarely confided in anyone. There was no one to confide in. The household structure isolated her, placing her at the center, yet depriving her of intimacy. She carried burdens that no one acknowledged, because acknowledging them would require admitting the cruelty embedded within the system they all upheld. And so, she continued, refined and silent, a monument carved by expectation rather than choice. Her suffering remained invisible, Not because it was small, but because she had learned to suffer beautifully. That was the true tragedy. She bore emotional wounds with such grace that people mistook her composure for contentment. They believed she was strong because she did not break, never considering that her strength came from knowing she had no permission to break at all. In moments of quiet reflection, when candlelight flickered against the walls, or when she sat alone after a long ceremony, she sometimes wondered who she might have been in a world that allowed wives to love openly and be loved without restraint. The thought lingered only briefly, disappearing like breath on cold glass. Such hidden anguish revealed how a life devoted to dignity could quietly strip a woman of the very tenderness that once defined her. It exposed the silent erosion of self that occurred when a person became a symbol, valued more for poise than for humanity. Through the steady restraint she maintained, a faint sorrow hinted that even her controlled world might soon demand a reckoning she could no longer deny. Life as a mistress unfolded inside a shifting landscape where nothing, neither affection, nor shelter, nor belonging, was ever guaranteed. She lived without title, without recognized standing, without the protections that even the lowest-ranking wife possessed by virtue of law. Her existence relied entirely on a man's desire. And desire, she learned early, was the most unstable foundation a woman could stand on. Every moment beside him felt both intimate and precarious, offered with tenderness, but shadowed by the threat of disappearance. She moved through the household like someone inhabiting borrowed space. Servants acknowledged her presence, yet never bowed. Nobles glanced at her with a polite indifference that barely concealed judgment. Every gesture toward her was calculated, measured, restrained, never warm enough to suggest acceptance, never cold enough to provoke offense. She understood these boundaries instinctively. She was welcome only as long as she remained unobtrusive. Her survival depended on her ability to occupy silence without being swallowed by it. From the beginning, she knew she held no safety. If the husband turned his attention elsewhere, she would lose everything at once: comfort, proximity, influence, and the small measure of tenderness she had carved out in secrecy. She owned no chamber that could not be reassigned, no possessions not subject to removal, no future protected by law. Even the affection she received bore conditions. It was offered in private, hidden from the world, always at risk of replacement. She never allowed herself to forget this, even when the husband held her with a softness that made her wish, briefly, for more. Dependence became her constant companion. She relied entirely on his goodwill, his gifts, his visits, his protection from gossip, and his willingness to keep her in his life. Without him, she had no voice in the household, no income of her own, no allies who would defend her should conflict arise. She learned to read his moods with an acuity sharpened by fear. A delayed visit, a distracted expression, a colder tone could send her spiraling into quiet dread. She adjusted herself accordingly, offering reassurance instead of need, gentleness instead of inquiry. Her affection, however real, could never be openly expressed without seeming like expectation. There were days when she felt cherished, when his words softened the loneliness that clung to her like a second skin. Yet even in those tender moments, she sensed how precariously her happiness was suspended. The husband could leave her chambers with a smile on his lips and make love to his wife the following night without contradiction. He could rely on her presence while never offering permanence. She belonged to him emotionally, but he did not belong to her in any form society recognized. Worse still, she lived with the knowledge that she could be erased at any time. Dismissal required no explanation. If scandal intensified, if political alliances shifted, if the wife exerted pressure, if the husband grew tired, her existence could vanish in a single day. Servants would remove her belongings. Doors that once opened quietly for her would remain closed. The household would move on, returning to equilibrium as though she had never lived within its walls. This threat haunted her, shaping her every choice. She avoided expressions of jealousy, knowing they could be interpreted as entitlement. She never questioned the husband's promises or absences. She swallowed her sorrow, concealed her longing, and softened her presence until it felt nearly weightless. She curated herself into someone easy to leave, hoping paradoxically that this made her easier to keep. Yet beneath this delicate performance lived a profound ache. She longed for recognition, not in grand ways, but in the simplest ones, to walk beside him openly, to speak without fear of consequence, to exist in his life without being hidden behind corridors and candlelit shadows. But such desires could not survive in her world. She learned to extinguish them before they took shape, protecting herself from heartbreak by denying hope. No one around her truly saw her suffering. To the wife, she was a source of humiliation. To servants, she was a curiosity kept at a polite distance. To the husband, she was comfort, not burdened by the weight of duty, not tied to lineage, not asking for anything except presence. To society, she was a warning whispered behind fans and goblets, a reminder that beauty without legitimacy held no real power. Still, she endured. She endured because leaving offered no better fate. She endured because moments of affection, however fleeting, felt worth preserving. She endured because she had shaped her identity around his gaze, even though she knew that gaze could abandon her. She endured because secrecy gave her small corners of life where tenderness felt real, even if temporary. But endurance did not erase the cost. It accumulated quietly, wearing her down in ways no one observed. Each unspoken fear settled into her bones. Each withheld desire carved another hollow space inside her. Each day lived without security, deepened the ache that came from knowing she could be forgotten in an instant. Such vulnerability revealed how affection without protection offered sweetness edged with danger. Binding her to a life shaped entirely by uncertainty, it exposed the quiet devastation of a woman who gave much while receiving so little she could claim as her own. As the weight of her fragile existence deepened, a muted signal began to rise, hinting that the constraints she obeyed might soon strain beyond what secrecy could contain. Freedom, in the Tudor household, existed only as an illusion, glimmering faintly, always out of reach, shaping each life with promises that dissolved the moment anyone tried to grasp them. The husband, the wife, and the mistress lived inside a structure that bound them more tightly than any chain could. Each carried burdens, shaped by roles they did not choose, yet were expected to embody with unwavering grace. And in the quiet hours when their facades loosened, each of them felt the truth settle heavily inside the spaces they rarely allowed themselves to acknowledge. None of them was free. The husband believed himself to be powerful. The world reinforced this belief daily, through the way servants parted as he passed, through the way nobles deferred to his decisions, through the ease with which he navigated the privileges afforded to his rank. Yet beneath these outward displays of authority, he lived within a cage built from expectation. Every action he took was scrutinized. His alliances were dictated by politics. His marriage predetermined by lineage. His public image shaped by forces outside his control. Even his private desires, indulged in secret chambers, tethered him to consequences he could not fully evade. His longing for comfort with the mistress was genuine, yet it created cracks in the very authority he relied upon. His need for stability from his wife grounded him, yet it suffocated him in moments when he wished for something softer. He was bound to both women by threads he could neither cut nor openly acknowledge. His decisions carried weight not only for himself, but for the entire household. And so, while he seemed the freest of the three, his life moved within walls built long before he was born. Walls that dictated who he must be, how he must appear, and which desires he must never reveal. The wife's bonds were more visible, though no less confining. Her life had been structured from the moment of her engagement. She was expected to represent dignity, to embody discipline, to preserve the lineage entrusted to her. She existed not as a woman, but as an emblem, one who must never falter, never expose pain, never betray the depth of her isolation. Her marriage promised stability, but not love. Her role demanded sacrifice, but offered little in return. She was tethered to the expectations of an entire society that looked to her for order. She had no permission to express anger when her husband strayed, no right to demand affection, no freedom to live according to her own desires. Her children depended on her endurance. Her status depended on her silence. Her identity dissolved daily beneath the weight of duty. She had become the face of honor, yet she paid for that honor with pieces of herself she never recovered. And then there was the mistress, perhaps the most trapped of all. She lived in the shadows, cherished privately but erased publicly, held close only in darkness. Her existence depended on fragility, the fragility of desire, of secrecy, of the husband's shifting affections. She possessed no rights, no protections, no foothold in the world beyond the chambers she occupied. She loved a man she could never claim, belonged to a life she could never enter, and built her days around moments that could disappear overnight. Her lack of title left her vulnerable. Her lack of recognition left her powerless. Her lack of freedom left her aching. She adapted, softened, diminished herself to survive. Yet even her gentleness could not guarantee safety. She lived always one breath away from dismissal, one rumor away from exile, one shift in the wind away from losing everything she had shaped her identity around. Her captivity was not physical. It was woven into the uncertainty of her place, the fragility of her influence, the silence she was forced to maintain. Still, the cruelest truth was that each of them, husband, wife, our mistress, believed at times that the others possessed something they lacked. The husband envied the quiet, emotional refuge the mistress offered. The wife envied the intimacy the husband sought elsewhere. The mistress envied the stability the wife's position secured. But none saw the chains binding the others until their own tightened beyond endurance. Their lives intersected in a triangle of longing: duty, fear, and performance. No one dared to speak the truths that pulsed beneath the surface. The husband's loneliness inside his authority, the wife's grief behind her dignity, the mistress's yearning buried beneath her restraint. The roles they inhabited left them unable to reach for one another honestly. Every gesture was shaped by consequence. Every silence carried the weight of survival. Every choice pressed against boundaries they could not break. Freedom, for all three, became something abstract, discussed only in their thoughts, imagined only in brief moments before reality reclaimed them. The household itself functioned because of their entrapment. The system survived on silence, endurance, sacrifice, and illusion. And though the world looked stable from the outside, each life inside it trembled with quiet longing for a different fate. Yet none would receive one. Such entanglement revealed how even power, duty, and desire could weave into forms of captivity none of them could escape. It exposed how deeply each life was shaped by forces beyond personal will, binding them to roles that demanded more of their humanity than they could safely reveal. And as their stories faded into the stillness of the manor's long corridors, a final truth lingered. The world they inhabited was built not on freedom, but on the sacrifices made in its absence. Thank you for listening, and for staying with these quiet, difficult histories that unfold in the shadows of Tudor life. May your night be gentle, your thoughts soft, and your sleep deep and untroubled. Good night.